Being crowned monarch of England is pretty straightforward. It will knock out most of the day between the ceremony and the diplomatic schmoozing afterwards, but it isn't a complex affair. Fancy robe, swear an oath to your people and the one Protestant god, crown, orb, sceptre. In our fast-paced modern world, this gilded folderol seems very elaborate, but to a dynastic Egyptian, it honestly looks a bit casual. The unofficial motto of ancient Egypt was, "Why take an hour to do something when you could take a week?" And their coronations were no exception. Buried within the ceremony was some very specific symbolism, and perhaps, if you're willing to read a bit far into things, even some interesting ideas about the nature and provenance of kingship. There is no coronation day for a pharaoh, but a coronation process, a month-long series of rites that will take most of a year to complete, culminating in the king's presentation before his people. Well, presentations, we'll get to that. As we discuss these ceremonies in brief, because they really do each warrant a video of their own, I think we should keep in mind the ultimate origin of the pharaoh and the rites by which a pharaoh is made. The united twin kingdoms of Upper and Lower Egypt are the product of war. The first pharaoh, Nama, seems to have cultivated the balanced image of a man who is at once ferocious against his enemies and very interested in peace and prosperity. As a result, the association between a transition of power and the end or continuation of armed conflict is one that permeates the imagery of the pharaoh. It's thought that the pharaoh, like most monarchs, became king in fact immediately upon the death of his predecessor, assuming the new pharaoh was the known heir. This is the accession. In that way ancient Egyptians are so fond of, the accession and coronation are often conflated in the historical record, but we know they're separate events, because while accession can take place literally at any time, coronation ceremonies appear to have largely begun on the next full moon after accession. They began in earlier days with the ceremonial smiting of the enemy. I say ceremonial because it was part of the ceremony, but it's suspected that actual enemies were indeed smited. Early pharaohs had no shortage of rivals. This enemy being smited was not, symbolically at least, a foreigner. It was a pretender to the dual crown. This ritual didn't symbolize the pharaoh's victory over other lands or the defeat of enemies in general, but specifically his domination of rival claimants, those who would bring disunity to the two kingdoms. It was likely not a literal act of murder once Egypt actually was unified, though we can't be sure. We like to imagine ancient civilizations as bloodthirsty, but I'm pretty sure the United States of America has performed more executions in the last 10 years than ancient Egypt would have done in the same time. I guess that depends on how you define death sentence, since there was always a desert to fight in or a monument to break your back building. Next, the pharaoh was featured in a grand parade which orbited the ancient capital Memphis. In ancient times, the city was known metonymically as the White Walls, and circling the White Walls on foot became part of the coronation ceremony. At least it was on foot in theory. Whether that tradition was maintained as the pharaohs became demigods and emperors, I'm not sure. Memphis was the symbol of Egypt's unity and the pacifying power of the pharaoh. Walking its perimeter was an act of formal claiming and unity of the person of the pharaoh with the edifice that represented their rule. The Feast of Sokar allowed the new king to revere his ancestors and entailed him rowing out to a sacred lake on a ceremonial boat, which also carried an image of the underworld god Sokar. This was both to acknowledge the passing of the late king and perhaps to symbolize the new king's part in the great cycle of mortality. The king rows westward, where one day his soul will voyage. What's next? The said feast. Never mind that, not very important. All you need to know is that it was part of the coronation year and would be repeated throughout the pharaoh's reign as a jubilee celebration. At long last, the king is revealed to his people in a ceremony called the Appearance. Actually, 3 ceremonies, or one ceremony with 3 ritual parts. Either way, the king ritually appears before his people, first as the king of Upper Egypt, then as the king of Lower Egypt, and then for a third and final time as the king of the 2 Egypts, champion of the 2 goddesses, son of Ra, all that. And I think that's significant. We talk about Nama unifying the 2 lands, and then for the most part we talk about the single nation of ancient Egypt. Rituals like this remind us that there were 2 kingdoms, with some folkways in common and shared history, but with different identities, geographies, cultural practices and so on, even different religions. It was a different thing to be king of Lower Egypt than it was to be king of Upper Egypt. The unification of the 2 cultures was, through ceremony, rendered miraculous. Here are your two kings in one man. Here is the living Horus, the energetic youth of the dawn, and the wise elder of dusk, in one man. He has done all of these things to prove himself worthy. Now, the Pharaoh was not elected, and other than all the normal ways history has shown us that a king can be removed, there was no formal mechanism for getting rid of a Pharaoh who wasn't up to scratch. It was an absolute monarchy, which more or less ran on the same hereditary principle that defines European monarchies.
When Pharaoh's around, then you get down on the ground.
But the promise of worthiness was one that had to be renewed. To be worthy of coronation was one thing, but to be fit to rule for the rest of your life was another. Remember when I mentioned earlier that the said feast was repeated? Come back next week and I'll talk more about the said festival, what it entailed, what it symbolised, and what it might tell us about Egyptian philosophy. Thanks so much for watching. Recently there's been an encouraging uptick in my views, comments and subscriptions, so if you're new around here then welcome. I've loved engaging with all of your comments and questions, even when we haven't seen eye to eye, and that's important. Egyptology is a humanities subject, and between the gaps in evidence there's room for interpretation. Blessings of all good things upon my beloved backers at patreon.com/armchairegypt, whose support is as generous as it is flattering. Until next time, my fellow armchair Egyptologists, life, prosperity and health to you all. Thanks for watching. Head over to my channel for more, or click here to see what the YouTube demons think you should watch next. I hope you'll consider subscribing. If you'd like to support and collaborate on the channel with me, go to patreon.com/armchairegypt. You can also join my Discord community, there's an invite link in the description.